Okay, good morning, and you're all very welcome to our symposium this morning. My name is Mary Canning, and I'm from UCD in Ireland, and I'm chairing this symposium with Bertrand Malch from Queen's in Canada, and another member who is linked in with this symposium but isn't here today, and that's Professor Brendan O'Dwyer from Allianz Manchester Business School, University of Amsterdam. Brendan is in Sydney at the moment and is unable to be with us. This symposium, the reason that we're having it really is to stimulate debate around a number of issues that relate to a special issue of the European Accounting Review that we have made a call for. And what we're hoping to achieve today with our panel of speakers is that debate will be stimulated to advance our understanding of audit practice from a broad number of perspectives, but also to encourage us all to produce research from both a theoretical and empirical perspective that will add to our knowledge base. The EOR special issue, we are hoping for papers to be submitted by the 30th of November 2018, and they can be submitted anytime from now. And just to give you a flavour of the issues that we're hoping, and this is really just to stimulate some ideas for you, but we're not limiting it to these particular ideas. But some of the issues that we thought about was that, firstly, when we look at the role of auditors and the nature of their interactions with auditees. Like when we think about audit, it isn't a one-way process, it's interacting with different individuals. And we can learn a lot about that interaction. In particular, what are the views of the auditee and how are they using auditors' work? Another issue that comes to mind is the landscape that we're now looking at in auditing. It has undergone significant reform from a regulatory point of view. And this regulatory reform, we're wondering, well, what is the impact that it's having on audit firms, both in terms of their managerial and organizational perspectives and practices? Another issue, and we saw it at the opening address, was the whole issue of blockchain data analytics. What impact is this having on audit firms, both in terms of the artificial intelligence and in big data? How are audit firms coping with this? What changes are occurring within their firms? When we think about auditing, we think about the audit culture that Mike Parr talked about and has been talked about, and we see it expanding. And these jurisdictional expansions, how are auditors doing that? How are they moving into new territories? And we can learn a lot about that. There has been some work, but we can learn a lot more. Yesterday I was at a paper that dealt with diversity in terms of language. And when we look at our auditing environment today in our auditing firms, they are and they proclaim to be very diverse organizations. So what is the nature and impact on the profession, on their efforts to create a more diverse environment? In particular, when we look at gender minority groups, how are they being embraced by the audit firms and what impact are they having on their audit work practices? And finally, a lot of the issues when we think about the auditing profession, a lot of our work focuses on the Big Four. But what about all of the other firms, our medium and small-sized firms? What are the challenges that they're facing? What can we learn from them? And all of the issues that I've noted above are also of importance to the non-Big Four. So that's just a flavour of the issues that we thought about for this special issue. But we're willing to accept a much broader range of issues in papers that are submitted to us. So today's symposium, if I can introduce to you our three speakers that are going to start and stimulate debate around some of the issues that we have raised. Our first speaker is Darren Thomas Baker from University College Dublin in Ireland. And Darren is a new scholar. He's a scholar, psychosocial scholar, with a research interest in equality and diversity, in CSR practices, and in compassionate leadership. Darren will reflect today on auditing in a neoliberal post-feminist world. And he will draw from his own research with female practitioners as to how they are coping with the gender discrimination that they're facing. And he'll talk to us about that today. Welcome, Darren. Our second speaker, Professor Chris Humphrey from Allianz Manchester Business School. Chris probably needs little introduction to most of you here today. For me, Chris is one of the great thinkers in auditing. He brings such passion to his work, and he also has such a belief in audit. And this enthusiasm that he brings encourages us to take on board his ideas. Today, Chris will reflect on an audit, and in an audit that is in trouble. And Chris won't shy away from that issue. He won't put his head in the sand. Instead, he will face up to it and ask us to face up to it in terms of what we can now do, take the space to reflect upon it, and perhaps engage in, not papering over the cracks, but in a dynamic repair. Welcome, Chris. And next up, we have Professor Yves Gendron. Yves from University of Laval in Canada. Once again, Yves needs little introduction to you here in the room. And when I think of Yves, Yves for me is everything I aspire to be in terms of being an auditing researcher. His critical conceptual approach to research, his generosity in sharing his knowledge with us, but not only in his research, but in the conversations that he's willing to have with us and to share these ideas. Today, Yves takes the baton from Chris, and he passes it back to us as researchers and asks us to think about innovation in auditing. But also, what do we mean? How do we conceptualize this notion of new directions in auditing research? You will note that we're not saying the future directions of auditing research, we're saying new directions in auditing research. Welcome, Yves. So I will hand you over now to our first speaker, Darren Thomas Baker. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel for inviting me to my first auditing conference. It's a real privilege to be here, and I hope some of the ideas I talk about today provoke questions and new ideas. So my presentation's entitled A Psychosocial Exploration into Gender Inequality in the Auditing Sector. So I'm going to talk firstly a little bit about the key terms that I draw on in my work, that they are post-feminism and neoliberalism, and how they come together and how scholars can begin to think about those key terms. The second point I'm going to talk about is sort of how auditing research currently appears quite complicit and unquestioning of some of the issues that I raise around neoliberalism and feminism, and how employing and drawing on psychosocial approaches is one way around getting out of this sort of neoliberal paradigm that we sometimes see in scholarly literature in auditing. And I'm also going to draw a bit about on my own work and how some of those ideas that I talk about come together in an academic project, and give an example of that and how some of those ideas I look at play out in an organizational situation. And then obviously just tie some of those ideas up at the end. So in terms of tracing the intersection between post-feminism and neoliberalism. In terms of post-feminism, as you can imagine with most academic terms, they are hotly contested and hotly debated. So I'm going to give you a very, very high-level overview of what, in the first place, post-feminism refers to. And scholars typically use the term post-feminism to refer to an epistemological break with previous feminist movements, mirroring postmodern and post-structuralist thinking and post-colonial thinking, particularly criticisms of how feminism is very much an Anglo-American dominated movement. The second way in which post-feminism as a term is often used is as an historical break, as a move or shift from second wave feminism. So whereas first wave feminism was dedicated to political change, particularly in the USA and the UK from the mid-19th century onwards through the right to vote, for instance. Second wave feminism, which emerged after the Second World War, focused on broader change for women, particularly looking at changing legislation in the workplace to ensure that it was supportive of women and other minority groups. And post-feminism in this sense follows second wave feminism. It's often synonymous to third wave feminism and represents this idea of how feminism has become more girly, more sexier brand of feminism that we perhaps saw in second and first wave forms of feminism. For instance, post-feminism in this sense explains women's contemporary unhappiness as pertaining to feminist demands and feminist concerns, or how men are often positioned as victims in the current movement of feminism, and how this can emerge in the forms of e-bile or criticism online for advocates of the feminist position. I employed the term post-feminism somewhat differently to these other definitions of post-feminism, and I use it more to refer to feminism as a cultural dispositif. So it differs from an historical or epistemological break from feminism, where feminism itself becomes the object of study. So in other words, post-feminism in this sense is looking at the feminist movement. It's studying feminism, the contemporary beliefs about gender, the contemporary beliefs about equality, and how these belief systems emerge, particularly in discourse, which I will talk a little bit about shortly. A really important strand of this form of post-feminism is how feminism intersects with neoliberalism. I'm sure many of you are familiar with how neoliberalism is traditionally explained as a political and economic rationale, which is characterized by deregulation and the rolling back of states, particularly in the provision of welfare. However, neoliberalism can be used to understand how contemporary identities or contemporary subjectivities are constructed, particularly through how Foucault would have described as the governing and governed. Post-feminist scholars have been debating the extent to which neoliberalism has colonized, has taken over, has made over feminism in ways that perhaps we would recognize as more palatable, as more amenable, and more digestible. And in particular, post-feminist scholars are really concerned about the rise or emergence of individualism amongst women, and perceptions of self-autonomy and agency and control in the lives of women. And how women also talk about how they can transform themselves, for instance, to become more confident or more resilient. And of course, as academics concerned with business and organisations, how do those concerns emerge in the daily lives of women in the workplace? So I just want to give a few words on sort of contemporary literature in Auditon. I think most of the literature on gender in the Auditon space appears to be rather complicit rather than critical of how women are positioned within this neoliberal frame, within the very neoliberalised economy that we currently have. For example, scholarship tends to focus on unquestionably issues regarding how women opt in or opt out of work-life balance initiatives, or how women perceive themselves as less confident in the workplace. So literature tends to accept those patterns without really questioning why they are emerging in the workplace. And so therefore there is a tendency for literature, not just in Auditon, but also more broadly, to sidestep those more profound questions regarding the relationship between neoliberal economic rationales and how they interconnect, shape, and move individuals within the workplace. It's really important, I think, for us to explore neoliberalism, particularly from the post-feminist lens that I've advocated, because it's not simply about adding more women to, for instance, executive level boards. There is an ethical imperative for scholars and for practitioners to think about and reflect on the operation of neoliberalism and neoliberal economic rationales in terms of how they shape women at a much more implicit and deeper level, and obviously how that works often implicitly to marginalize and reproduce inequalities in the workplace. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about psychosocial methods and some of the tools and perspectives that psychosocial scholars raise, and how they can be helpful in terms of tackling some of the challenges that I've outlined thus far in the presentation. So I think some of the questions I've raised, scholars would typically look at discourses, but there is a real question around why we see individuals, and in this case women, taking certain positions, investing themselves in certain positions within the workplace. And psychosocial scholars begin to unpick and explore some of these deeper questions that perhaps I have raised today. This requires an engagement with psychoanalysis, but not exclusively. And whereas psychoanalysts would study an individual case at a very deep level, so they would study and theorize an individual person, psychosocial scholars may well do that, but they will also take a much more holistic view of the construction of an individual. So they will also engage with those broader, our broad understanding of economic and discursive rationales. So it's really, psychosocial scholars will work across multiple levels, from the individual engagement with psychoanalysis through to engaging with broader discourses that may be circulating within particular contexts or within particular economies. Psychosocial scholars have been particularly critical of qualitative research in general. For instance, they have been very critical of how qualitative researchers carry out interviews, for instance, in what is often a very prescriptive question and answer form. And, psychosocial scholars are more interested in creating maximum scope and space for participants, for individuals in a research context to to free associate and to talk at length about their own biographies. And psychosocial scholars typically adopt quite psychoanalytical approaches. For instance, the ideas of free association by Freud, as well as Gestalt by German ethnographers, to understand some of the ways in which accounts given by participants are effectively and unconsciously driven. So obviously that was something of a whistle-stop tour of the key ideas around post-feminism and neoliberalism, and some of the ways in which psychosocial scholars can begin to explore some of the challenges perhaps that emerge when post-feminist scholars contemplate the operation of neoliberalism and inequalities and processes of inequalities in the workplace. And I suppose the question I want to now explore is around how some of the ideas that I've just traced can be brought together in an academic project, in a research project, particularly in auditing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my new paper, which has just been published in Human Relations, which is entitled "Splitting and Blaming the Psychic Life of Neoliberal Executive Women." And just in terms of a bit of background on this project was sponsored by the Economic and Social Research Council, which is a non-governmental funding body in the UK, and the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the overall objective of the research was to explore the career biographies of men and women in finance and accounting in the UK, and their experiences advancing their career in the sector, as well as the impediments and perhaps enablers to their career progression in the sector. In total, I conducted 66 psychoanalytically inflected interviews, drawing on many of the ideas that I raised in the previous slides. And these interviews lasted anywhere between 60 to 120 minutes. 36 interviews were conducted with women, 16 executive and 20 non-executive women, and 30 interviews with men, 15 executives and 15 non-executives. And one of the central findings from the research was the identification of a pattern whereby women would deny inequality whilst also simultaneously accounting for apparent instances of discrimination in the workplace. So there was a fundamental contradiction in many of the accounts given by women regarding their own experiences of the workplace, as well as how they described or spoke about their perceptions of the workplace as fair. And we wanted to understand why this contradiction was emerging in the workplace, so why women denying inequality whilst also talking about particular instances in their biographies which were discriminatory or unfair. And we drew on the work of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, who was the founder of the British Object Relations movement. And using her work, we were able to identify two unconscious processes that were at play in this contradiction in the accounts of women. And we identified, firstly, the first process was splitting, and women split off the negative aspects of the workplace as a way to protect ideals of the workplace as fair, providing they worked hard and persevered at their career. And the second dynamic was around blaming, and women tended to blame other women for the continued underrepresentation of women at senior levels within the sector. I want to give you a little example around how one would identify, or how those dynamics would actually play out in the accounts given by women. And in this example, Jack is the MD of an auditing practice, and he is aware that only 9% of his partners in his practice are women. And he wants to understand why there are so few women in his accounting practice. He's also aware that many women tend to leave his practice at or around the mid-manager level. And what Jack does is he conducts a number of interviews with his senior women, with the women partners in his practice, to understand the reasons why women find it difficult to access senior positions. And in this example, he's talking to Sarah, who is a female partner in his practice. So this is Sarah. This is Jack. And he's talking to Sarah about her experiences so far. And Sarah talks about how she's never had or experienced discrimination in the workplace. However, she does mention an experience that she had a few years ago when she wasn't promoted and remunerated as well as her peer Keith, despite the fact that she had better financials, so she had better revenue than her colleague Keith, who was promoted ahead of her. However, in the extract, she doesn't define this as discrimination. What she tries to do is describe this as something she had to get over, an obstacle that she had to get over. And Jack asks her if she can tell him a little bit more about this, about her experience of particularly the remuneration instance. And Sarah moves towards talking about how women in general expect success. They expect things to be placed on their lap, and how she just had to make it work in order to be successful and in order for her to reach eventually partner level in the practice. So that's an example of splitting and blaming. So as we can see in the account of Sarah, she repudiates the potentially discriminatory period she had when she wasn't promoted alongside her colleague Keith. And instead what she does is she frames other women as potentially at fault for the continued underrepresentation of women in general in the workplace. And so splitting in this sense signifies a subconscious defense mechanism used by women to maintain an ideal of the workplace, whereby if you work hard, regardless of your gender, you will be successful, and blaming functions as a way for women to displace their own anxiety-laden memories of mistreatment and unfairness in the workplace. So I hope some of the ideas that I've raised around post-feminism and neoliberalism and the importance of looking at that in terms of understanding how women continue to be marginalised in the organisation, and how psychosocial studies can help explore some of those deeper questions that perhaps we have to ask as scholars in the workplace to understand those dynamics. Thank you.
Right, good morning everybody. We'll explain this slide a little bit later in the presentation. I only have 2 slides, so just listen to what I'm going to say, and I hope you can follow it. I guess briefly I wanted to start by saying, well, why am I here? And 9:20 discussing auditing. Well, as Mary said at the beginning, auditing matters, and it matters to me. I think it's a very important aspect of society, and lots that can be done in this area. So I guess my concern in a sense here with new directions, primarily it's a practice concern. I'm concerned with the nature of practice, but in terms of new directions, what I want is new ways of thinking about audit. And one of the concerns that I have at the moment is that we seem to be stuck in a certain way of thinking about audit. In many ways, when you're looking at the way in which audit is approached, the concept of audit is taken as a given. It's not discussed basically in terms of reform processes. Reforms are largely about implementation and delivery of audit, but not about reforming audit itself as a concept. And what I'm going to try and focus on today is reviewing the concept of audit and maybe a different way of thinking about audit, and through that, a different way of contemplating what audit is and represents. And in that process, I think I'll just get my glasses. In that process of trying to think differently about audit, I think we're running the risk in terms of some of the way in which reforms are being approached, that there's sort of emphasis on quick fixes, on doable reforms, maybe reforms we've already tried. I mean, one of the common ones at the moment is we need more big firms. We did have more big firms, and we still had audit scandals. So, even people like Prem Seeker have argued that, just think carefully when you're looking at these reforms, because a number of them have been tried before. But if you think about the importance of needing to think differently, one way of categorizing this is just think how we label or describe audit history. In many areas, we talk about success of history. Computer technology massively developed, telephone technology massively developed. When we talk about audit history, we talk about audit in a way where we landmark failures. So we landmark everything around a major crisis or scandal. So we talk about being post-BCCI, post-savings and loans, post the Asian crisis, post-Enron, post the global financial crisis. That's not a history of success. In the sense, that's a history of failure. Another way of thinking about the need to think differently about audit, think about the number of times you've heard we're going to have a future of the audit investigation. I mean, I'm really quite fascinated to do a history of future of the audit investigations, to see how different they are over the years. The best one I found was there was a history of audit investigation in 1940-41 in the UK at the time of the Second World War. So, there are some strange periods in time when audit future is contemplated, and it would be a fascinating history to look at that. So, what I felt, in a way, is maybe we need to start to review the sort of dynamic nature of some of the assumptions that underpin the way we look at audit and the way we look at audit research. One of the very famous phrases that Anthony Hopwood used to use and promoted was, the notion and importance of studying accounting becoming what it was not. Accounting becomes something else. It changes. There's a dynamic of change, and we should study this dynamic of change and the influences on and what shapes accounting change. I think that's sort of an approach that has underpinned a lot of audit research, but I think it needs reviewing, because in many ways the stories stay the same with audit. The audit expectation gap isn't a dynamic concept, it's a fairly fixed concept around the same issues of independence, evidence collection, liability, various other things. So I felt in some ways we need to maybe ask a different question, is instead of asking, auditing or looking at auditing becoming what it was not, why don't we ask, why did auditing not become something? What auditing never became? Let's start looking at that. The things that audit didn't become. Because I think if we do that, it probably allows us to focus more on the dilemmas, the contradictions, the pressures, the forces that resist change, that prevent change from taking place. And more subtly, I think it probably gets us down to some of the more uncomfortable dimensions of practice that we gloss over, the myths about practice that we over-rely on. And so I think, in a way, asking this sort of question will give us a different sort of set of standpoints, perspectives, create space for alternative thoughts and different constructions of audit futures. And I'll try and explain as we go through how we may be able to do that. But I think for me, the benefit of that type of interrogative questioning would be that it starts us to focus more on the concept of audit rather than the way we do a particular form of audit. And as an illustration, Mary in a summary just said, we talk about the rise of the audit culture. Now, when people talk about the rise of the audit culture in various organizations, societies, whatever, universities, we don't talk about it positively. It's a negative. The rise, the audit society. Nobody says, I really want to live in an audit society. But when you talk to the accountants and everything, no, audit is the bedrock of society. It works in the public interest. So how do you have that contrast? How do we sustain that contrast? That's why, why has that contrast existed? Why has it not been removed? So a few of the questions, for instance, about alternative ways of thinking about audit. What audit didn't become? Why didn't audit become more interesting? Why is it always boring? Why didn't audit become free of an audit expectations gap? Why is it not less regulated? Why has it not got better with so much regulation? Why is it not easy to explain what is audit, particularly when audit is supposed to be a public interest function, serving the interests of the public, but the public don't understand it? Massive contradiction. Why is it not retained by the majority of SMEs when they have the opportunity to retain the audit? Why have they got rid of it? Why is it not easy to access audit firms? Why is that so difficult? I know people will have various explanations for those, but very often they're myth-like explanations. They're not tried and tested. One of the explanations is that the audit expectations gap is a dynamic. Society's expectations change and auditors have to respond to it. No, it's not. It's a very fixed gap. So I think in some ways, if we start to go through those questions, maybe there's a danger at times that we slip into a technicist mode with audit. The new set of techniques, data analytics, various other forms of techniques, statistical sampling over time. We get a little bit lost. We focus on the techniques, and we get a little bit lost from the concepts. Many of these techniques are still ways of doing an audit, but doing it more efficiently, more quickly, etc. We're not doing or looking at audit in a very different way. And I think, above and beyond this, I've been puzzling why we are so reluctant. Look how many times the word audit's used. And also think about the way in which audit crisis happens. In some countries, when an audit scandal takes place, it's a one-off. It's a one-off. It's something that isn't reflective of general practice. In other countries, it's an indication of the general failing of practice. So there are differences. You compare audit scandals in Japan, audit scandals in the UK, very different reactions. And I started to come around and spent a lot of time looking at with colleagues as well that I've been working with in a range of universities, but looking at the concept of a phrase, and this is a little bit where the picture comes in, of an audit is an audit. That's the explanation, or even worse, an audit is an audit is an audit. Where's that come from? It's a really dull explanation of an audit. What's an audit? Oh, it's an audit. Is that all you can say about audit? Nothing special about audit? Now, here we go. A football match is not a football match. I sort of had the ambition, I wanted to be in Milan. I support Liverpool. I wanted to be in Milan to say, Liverpool beat Milan in Istanbul. One of the best games ever. 3-0 down, 3-3 win on penalties. And I thought I could match that with Liverpool beat Real Madrid, but they didn't. So obviously, football matches are not football matches. Pictures are not pictures. Movies are not just movies. Food is just not food. I ask my students, from all over the world, what do you think of English food? Ever been to an English restaurant? You don't find English restaurants. Language is not just a language. Things vary. Things are different. We have a culture in this community of eliminating difference. You even have, heads of senior professional bodies in the global community saying, difference is against the public interest. Yet audit is about listening and learning. You can learn from difference. We're eliminating difference. So in some ways, I think we have to start to think about where audit's going with this sort of dimension, the way in which we envisage it. And particularly significantly here is if you trace it through, and IFAC have got 2 policy declarations which really spend a lot of time discussing the concept of an audit as an audit. And it's very clear that this whole concept has been wrapped up with audit standards now. Audit standards, ISAs as an example, are quality standards. And it's sort of now become that an audit is an audit as long as it's done in accordance with ISAs. So an audit is a quality audit if it's done in accordance with ISAs. So if you start to disrupt the concept of audit, you disrupt the concept of standards, you disrupt the infrastructure around standards, which makes it very difficult to change. And I think that's a really big challenge going forward, particularly in the sense that when you look in the accounting profession, actually you do have the standard setters encouraging innovation, particularly with the, the expanded audit report of recent years. But in the accounting profession, when you've got this standard setting mentality and mindset, what is invoked is a compliance mindset. We do what the standard says. Ironically, when the standard setters say we want innovation, okay, well tell us more. In what ways do you want us to innovate? Tell us more. Just tell us what you want. And then you start thinking, how come we survived without all these standards for so long? Where have we gone? Where's the profession gone in this sort of area? I mean, one of the papers that I worked on with a couple of colleagues was about the history of business risk auditing. If you look at that paper in Auditing Journal of Practice and Theory, you'll see how actually potentially a very dynamic reform, which although in terms of the way it was framed, maybe didn't provide a completely different way of doing audit, there were opportunities there to provide a different way of doing audit. It got dropped for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to go in for. But in many respects, the reasons were the power of the contextual variables shaping and operating around audit makes change very, very difficult, which I suspect is one reason why you find with all the criticism that's ongoing at the moment, how there's quite a silence in the accounting profession. I don't think they know what to say. There'll be a lot of talk going on behind the scenes, but very difficult to respond. But also very difficult when you see, parliamentary inquiry committees are very difficult venues to respond to. But, very often always saying, I know you won't understand this in your world, but this is the way we operate. Well, I think we have to move beyond that. So what I'll do in closing is we've got sort of a few reflections on alternative thoughts. One is and we heard it last night, accounting is a craft. So I went back to craftsmanship, looking at the work of a sociologist called Richard Sennett, who's written books on craftsmanship. It has a very interesting concept when you get onto how craftsmen approach repairs. Craftsmen regard repairs in two forms, either a static repair or a dynamic repair. A static repair puts your broken violin back to what it was before. A dynamic repair changes it to do something else. So if you think about an audit as an audit only allows you static repairs. It doesn't allow a dynamic repair. So start thinking about what a dynamic repair would be in audit. In some ways, a quick example is, if you look at different standard setting regimes, I started to look at electronic and electrical engineering as a regime and just see what the standard setting world was like in there. They have incredible quotes about the standard setting in electronics. Think Bluetooth technology, for instance. You set standards in Bluetooth technology, you've got to get a space for everybody to agree a certain type of technology. And then they develop products on the back of that. So people in electronic engineering say standard setting encourages, promotes innovation because it creates the space for innovation. It creates the space for different products. In audit, any development you do in audit, it's not audit. It's assurance. Something else. It's not audit. An audit is an audit. You don't understand. Sorry, an audit is an audit, but we don't understand. Why is it so difficult to understand? So just think of that. In different regimes, standard setters do different things. Intellectual capital. In some standard setting regimes, if you get your patent into the standard, you've got to sort of give up major rights to the patent. They've got to be reasonable, non-discriminatory. IFAC, when it talks about standards, talks about its intellectual capital in ISAs. So ISAs matter to IFAC. But IFAC also says they're working in the public interest. So it's obviously a balance to maintain. Need to review some of that. Last sort of point really as well is if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, second slide. You won't be able to read this, but the gist of the outline is what IFAC does is in the center. Many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are on the outside. More difficult to influence. So, and basically we do this, it leads to this, and maybe influences this. What we do is what we do, and it's in the public interest. I don't think that's good enough anymore. You cannot say what we do is in the public interest if we've got all these problems. Think about it. If you're in Syria, Lebanon, wherever you are, you know, various developing nations, and somebody comes along and says, look, if you adopt ISAs and if you adopt IFRS and you get a lower cost of capital, and then you attract more in with investment, and then you get companies and you make more profits and something else, and eventually you get social inequality reduced and you grow. That's a very indirect way for audit and accounting to influence things. And a lot of myths build up about the extent to which you influence in that way. Why can't we be more direct? Why can't we re-invert that circle and put the sustainability development goals in the center and says, how do we develop audit in response to these goals? Can we do something else? Our auditors just stuck being, you know, checkers and truth stayers or whatever. Can they do more? You know, standard line. If your company's going down, do you want an auditor to say, look, you know, your accounts are accurately stated, but you're going bust? Or do you want the auditor to say, we can help you? We can get the company recovered, just at a very simple level. So I think in some ways, you know, what we have to do is just start to think radically different about the concept of audit, particularly because the bedrock on which it's based is a persistent fundamental audit expectations gap. And we've got the creativity in the profession to do that. And just a couple of comments to finish with. You know, if we're going to be a bit more direct, I mean, I got a quote. Now, this is not, well, I shouldn't tell you the date. You try and guess it. In conclusion, what I've been trying to say is that imagination and dynamism have seized our profession and its leaders. The spirit of a renewal is alive. The cumulative effect of space-age technology, world oneness, and social awakening has placed its mark indelibly on the direction and path of the accounting profession. For the new generation of accountants, a great challenge lies ahead. It is a challenge to serve society to an extent unmatched in all history. It is a challenge to each accountant to serve himself and herself, but that'll date it for you, because the and herself is not there, by applying all his/her capabilities towards rounded intellectual growth in a socially necessary function. 1965, 53 years ago. Where's the dynamics? An audit is an audit, right? That's David Lenois in the Accounting Review, which at that stage was actually very interested in social audit and social accounting. Just the very final comment. I mean, I've mentioned about post-Enron, post this, that, and the other. I got a book, I think by a guy called Brewster, on how the accounting profession forfeited public trust, written around 2003. There's a chapter in there called The Death of Audit. Audit is dying rather slowly. It's a lingering death. Can't we bring it back to life? That would be my final sort of comment. Okay, thank you very much.
Buongiorno. I would like to begin by thanking Mary and Bertrand for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's been a very interesting experience to be thinking about new directions for auditing research. Auditing is my primary field of research, and it feels good to be thinking about the field in general. It's an interesting experience as well because it's quite unconstrained. I just had to develop slides. No reviewers would be involved in telling me how bad or how good they are. So I felt quite unconstrained. So what you will see is my thoughts, which survived a few self-examination. Okay, so in order to set the stage, I will briefly refer to the notion of innovativeness and obstacles to innovation. So the theme of this symposium is new directions for auditing research. This relates, I think, quite directly to the notion of innovation, so trying to make auditing research more innovative. Innovation and new directions, in my mind, speak about a sustainable research community. Chris and I, a few years ago, we wrote a guest editorial in Critical Perspective on Accounting, where we developed this notion of sustainable research community. So, and there's an excerpt on this slide. So basically, it's a community which is vibrant, inspired, inspiring, reflexive, and communicative. Okay, and I would argue that these words basically resonate quite well with a community which strives to improve, which strives to develop new knowledge, to see auditing, for instance, in a different way. So we might think that, well, this is quite normal. This should be the natural state of a research community, but it is not. Energy is required in order to ensure that we live in a sustainable research community. So here are a few basic obstacles. The first one, and I'm quite brief on this one, I could elaborate more, but I have 15 minutes. Practice-based obstacle. So empirical research plays a key role in developing new ideas for auditing research. Empirical basically means that quite often we need to study practitioners, so we need to obtain access to practitioners, and sometimes it could be a challenge. The challenges also come from within the community, the research community. Okay, this slide is quite probably too small, but there are three main concepts on this slide. Stagnation, rankings, and gap spotting. Okay, and these three concepts are basically, I would argue, under the control of the research community. Stagnation. A number of people, quantitative researchers in accounting research, are quite worried at the extent to which innovation is not that obvious in the domain of accounting research. Part of the problem relates to two elements. The first one is journal rankings, which are increasingly influential, and which, when they are excessively influential, rankings basically motivate many people to publish in the same tiny set of accounting journals. And these journals, like all journals, they have their own preferences. So basically, when we behave like this, all of us trying to publish in the same tiny set of journals, well, our research gets more and more similar in a way. The other element which participates to stagnation is gap spotting. So this is coming from Mats Alvesson's research. Basically, Mats Alvesson and his colleague Sandberg, they believe that business academics are increasingly docile, compliant vis-à-vis the research literature, in the sense that we tend to rely perhaps excessively on the literature in order to define our research questions and research problems. And when we do this excessively, then we are less likely to innovate. In order to illustrate what I mean by this, here are a few questions. So the first question, a number of you may carry out quantitative research using audit fees. Will the 100th study on audit fee regression, will it be innovative? Now, looking at the content of inspection reports from independent audit regulators such as PCAOB, CPAB, H3C in France, to what extent is the 100th study on this will be innovative? Perhaps, but perhaps the likelihood of being innovative decreases over time. Okay, so initiatives that aim to develop, to encourage new directions are, I think, very welcome in an age where a number of people are concerned about research stagnation. So what I did, and this is the core of my presentation, so in order to conceptualize new directions for auditing research, I rely on the notion of boxed-in research and going beyond the boxes, which is again from Mats Alvesson. And I also borrow an approach from Burawoy, who published a very interesting paper in sociology, thinking about where is sociology going. And in order to do that, Burawoy relies on two very basic questions: research for whom, research for what. So I'm just translating these two questions in a different way, and this will allow us to get a kind of matrix or a figure in order to think about new directions for auditing research. So the two questions I propose: auditing for whom, in the sense that what is the audit setting that we aim to study? Is this a setting which is conventional in the sense that we study the establishment? So we study the large accounting firms, or we study the accounting institutes? Or do we aim to study unconventional settings? Second question, audit research for what? Okay, and then this relates to a classic tension, I would say, between the means and the ends of auditing research. So are we carrying out research in an instrumental way or in a reflexive way? So when we combine on a graph these two dimensions, we get something which could perhaps be inspiring. Okay, so we get this, and I will talk a little about this figure, which I'm then going to translate, okay, in order to identify a few ideas for future research, a few new directions. Okay, some comments about this figure. Let me see if this works. Yeah. Okay. Okay. At the top, we have the question, auditing for whom? Conventional setting or unconventional? And the other dimension, instrumental and reflexive, in other words, auditing research for what? Instrumental in the sense that as researchers, do we focus on the means of auditing without being much reflexive about the ends? Or are we carrying out a reflexive approach in the sense, are we quite reflexive about the ends of auditing? So combining this, we get 4 quadrants. One of them, I would say, is related to status quo. Okay, so these are studies which are focused on large accounting firms, accounting institutes, and these research basically do not really seek to promote fundamental change in prevailing audit technologies and institutions. So, this is status quo. If we move away from status quo, if we get to the other cells, quadrant 1. Okay, so in this cell, studies aim to better understand actors at the periphery of the auditing field. But the authors here are not really concerned about developing fundamental changes, so no fundamental change. If we move to quadrant 3, then we are still focused on the accounting, the auditing establishment, but the researcher is then quite interested about being reflexive about the ends of auditing, and if necessary, the researchers may elaborate on fundamental changes to audit technologies and institutions. And finally, quadrant 4, then we study unconventional setting in a reflexive way, being interested to better understand the role of auditing in a different environment and being quite reflexive about the ends of auditing. So if we translate this into some suggestions for future research, okay, this is quite preliminary, as I mentioned. No reviewers criticized this until now. But overall, I think it makes sense. Some of these suggestions relate quite well to qualitative research, but a few of these suggestions, I think, could be carried out using quantitative ways of investigating objects. So, on the next slides, I will talk about these 6 new directions. So I will briefly, okay, wow, 5 minutes, okay, just a second. Okay, so I will talk about these six new directions. First one, study of peripheral auditors, peripheral actors. Typically, most audit research, there are some exceptions, but most audit research is basically focused at the auditing establishment. And I would argue that there is a need for more research on other types of auditors, smaller firm auditors, tax auditors, etc. I think it's important to develop knowledge on these peripheral actors because first of all, they're marginalized in the field of auditing. And they're also marginalized by auditing researchers who do not study them quite often. Okay, second area, jurisdictional contests in audit field. So there's a good review of literature on this, which has been published a few years ago in AAAJ. So we might think that, okay, we already know what's going on regarding jurisdictional contests. But these contests are perpetual. The environment in which auditing takes place change over time, sometimes quite fast. So I would argue, for instance, that studying socio-environmental auditing is a promising area of research, and studying the ways in which auditors are trying to get a foothold into the domain of blockchain, big data, artificial intelligence. This is also a promising area. Okay, third area, in-depth analysis of organizational life. Unfortunately, as editor, as associate editor, I don't see very often in-depth examinations of daily life in auditing settings. I identified here a few of these previous research, which are really, really, I think, important and interesting. This type of research plays a key role because it provides us with detailed information about what's going on backstage of auditing. And these studies basically provide knowledge which is also useful to other researchers, investigating auditing with other methods. So I would argue that there is a critical need for such type of research. Historical research on domination in audit field. Unfortunately, I don't see much historical research being carried out in auditing. It's deplorable because society is characterized by a very significant tendency to forget the practices that we do. Where do they come from? The meaning we give to some concepts, which we take for granted quite often, but there's a history to that. So historical research is important. I would say I would recommend a genealogical approach, but this is just one suggestion, to investigate auditing concepts. And those of you who would like to investigate this idea, I invite you to look at a very important article written by the late Norman McIntosh, 2009, Accounting Historians Journal. Okay, my fifth area, examination of what's going on in terms of regulatory space dynamics. There's a key tension in auditing. It has always been there between regulation and self-regulation. After N1, big changes in the regulatory space, but these changes are perpetual. So I would encourage more research on that and focusing on the regulatory space is good because it allows us to explore key tensions between, for instance, the global and the local, or between status quo and change. Finally, my last suggestion, examination of social consequences engendered by auditing. We don't know much about these social consequences. To some extent, my power deals with the matter in his classic book, The Audit Society. Here and there in the auditing literature, some researchers explore the matter, but not very much. So I would say that we have a crucial need to better understand the social consequences ensuing from auditing. This could be carried out from a qualitative or quantitative perspective. Okay, and finally, I will end with this. European Accounting Review has a special issue in order to encourage new directions in auditing research. Simultaneously, critical perspective on accounting also has a call for paper with a different flavor, though. In this, the guest editors are Anna Samsonova and I. We're trying to encourage the development of critical auditing studies. Okay, so we believe that there is a need for more research into this area. Okay, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Yves, Chris, and Darren for those inspiring presentation. I think we can jump right now to the period question. If some people would like to react, comment, propose ideas, we have someone there.
Hello, Sebastian Kronberger from Hannover, Germany, and I do theory work. Theory, I mean analytical modeling. I was missing this now in this whole presentation a bit, and also when I go through the CVs of the editor of the special issue, I wondered if you're looking for theory work as analytical modeling in that special issue, and related to that, how you would deal with these kind of submissions, then maybe to Mary Canning the question.
We're certainly open to all papers, so please do feel free to submit your paper to us, and certainly we're open to that.
And the add-on is, how would you address that? Do you involve different editors with analytical modeling expertise, like really in the very center of the expertise, or?
I guess with any special issue in any journal where we don't have the expertise, we will seek expertise from our reviewers, so that will not be a problem.
Great panel, thank you. I spent about a decade of my life doing litigation, preparing cases against accountants. And I was particularly struck by Chris's comments about standard setting and how we've become kind of, well, we just try to comply with standards. Now, one of the areas I would love to see researched is this idea that rules or standards define the minimum level of acceptable moral conduct. That's what they do. And if you look at the failures of the past 15 years, almost universally, it was the rules that were being abused. They were the minimum standard. They were looked at as a vehicle for manipulating or accepting proposed results. So one of the areas I would love you guys to comment on is whether or not you see any of that, because it seems to me a fairly critical area that affects a lot of people. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I very much encourage studies of the development of standards and the increasing reliance that we place on them, and the impact that they have in terms of shaping the way in which people approach their work. So yeah, I very much encourage it.
I agree. There will be a few forthcoming articles in accounting journals which examine the extent to which in the USA, as a result of the PCAOB inspections, a number of the Big Four are increasingly and perhaps excessively compliant towards auditing standards, ticking boxes. And a number of people in these firms are increasingly concerned about are we missing something as auditors by being too much focused on complying with standards? So this is, I think these studies will be interesting. I would also add that what would be really relevant to examine would be gray areas. Okay, so standards typically they cannot deal with all situations. In addition, I would say that interpretation by auditors on the field is inevitable. So they need to interpret the standards. So I feel that there is a need for research in the ways in which auditors translate standards, and perhaps how do they deal with situations in which what the standards say is not that clear, the gray situations.
Hi, my name is Henriette Prast. I'm the chair of the board of the Dutch Foundation for Auditing Research, which was established to promote the quality of auditing research. I have a question to to the first speaker, Mr. Baker. You presented an explanation of why women, on the one hand, deny that they are discriminated, and on the other hand, they say they are discriminated. And what I found a bit disturbing is that it seems that you put the blame on women, as is usually done. That's the traditional view. Women should change. Women are splitting. Women are blaming. Instead of pointing at all the evidence showing that if a woman, for instance, rejects tasks that do not promote her career, she is blamed for that by the staff, by the colleagues, by the boss. So if she refuses those tasks, she is blamed. If she accepts them, she does not promote her career, so she can never make a good choice. There's a lot of evidence about this in academia in general, and in STEM and finance academia in particular. So I'm a bit puzzled that in this panel, in this session, again, the implicit message is women should behave differently. So that's my question.
Yeah, I appreciate, obviously, it was, as I suggested, a whistle-stop tour. So in the presentation, I spoke a lot about neoliberalism. And obviously, as a psychosocial scholar, what I'm interested in understanding is why women are saying what they are saying. And in that sense, you know, I'm not blaming women. Actually, what I'm pointing us towards is the idea that current social and economic conditions shape us in ways that are that point us towards, for instance, repudiating and denying inequality. And so actually the fault here is with the current culture that we have in workplaces. And that's, as a psychosocial scholar, I'm marrying those two things up. So the psychic element is an implication of a wider culture rather than it emerging from women. But of course, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's really important to address, you know, the unconscious psychic element, because of course if we don't, that's why we find that often women are unable to or don't necessarily, you know, address and engage with discriminatory practices that are around them. So it's a combination of both understanding those broader perspectives but also understanding the dynamics.
But why don't you focus on the unconscious psychological mechanisms of men? in that environment? So I don't need an answer, but it's just puzzling me. And if we really want to have innovative research, I would suggest to pay some attention to it.
I think I definitely say go, definitely refer to my article. I think that will help you sort of, understand at a much deeper level the perspectives that I bring to bear in the research. But as I've said in the presentation, it is important to look at women as well as men. And in other parts of my research, I do look at men. It's just, and obviously in this particular paper, I do look at women. And it is really important that we look at that to ensure that we can support, organizational change and how we can, essentially make women more aware of the discriminatory practices that are around them. No, it's not. You're not understanding the research fully. I'd definitely say go away and read the paper, because actually from a post-feminist perspective, I'm very conscious of the structures that are around women and how they are shaping women in an unconscious way. Right? So that's the difference in the research here. So definitely go away and read the paper. Any questions afterwards, do come along. Very happy to hear criticism, but that isn't one thing I definitely sort of push back against.
Giuseppe Galassi, University of Parma, Italy. Thanks very much for your presentations, because they are really interesting. New avenues of research in auditing field. We need just to devise the new avenues. First of all, we need, as far as I know at least, a kind of research on the history of auditing, standard auditing behavior, and so on and so forth. This is very important. Someone remembered in the presentation about this big hole in auditing research. If we don't know the foundations, the history, is so difficult to build something new, fair for the future. This is the first avenue of research. And the second avenue, tightly connected with the previous one, is a kind of epistemological research in this field, because the auditor needs to strengthen, to believe in his opinion. But to do that, it is necessary to study, understand the degree of belief, the degree of confirmation, the subjective probability in the opinion is going to present, and so on and so forth. These are two avenues of research, tightly connected, but very important, as far as I know. Thanks very much.
We have someone here.
Steve Salterio, Queen's University in Canada. I've set through these sorts of new directions in auditing research from both a interpretivist perspective and from a positivist perspective. And I have to say they are both equally uninspiring. I had hoped that there would be a real clarion call here for some different direction. And other than the social analytic ideas of Darren, which I think might have some promise, I didn't hear much new. And it's the same thing that I have when I go and listen to the quantitative folks speak. It really seems that we are at a stage in the development of audit research where we really don't have a question about what it is we should be doing and what our role should be. And I think the closest that the panel came to dealing with this is Professor Humphreys. I would encourage him to elaborate on his theme in response to my question, but I really think that both sides of the aisle, both interpretivist sides, critical groups, and the positive groups are in an equally uninspiring position right now with respect to where we should take our research. And I really think we need to break out of this almost like the audit. Sally, same as last year.
I'm less miserable than you, Steve. Sorry. I think there's all sorts of opportunities. I mean, I don't know if you really were listening to what we were saying, but there's the whole debate about the concept of the audit. Reinvent it. Think about what you're doing. Think about the way in which the whole approach to auditing has changed over the years. Look at the growing influence of standards. Look at the growing influence of regulation. What is it doing for professionalism? What does it mean? There's umpteen opportunities to study it. I think, if anything, one thing which is very important is the extent to what is I'd say the challenge is what is the importance of audit research? Have audit researchers subordinated themselves in large part to being the sort of proof checkers of regulatory reforms that people want to implement? So a lot of debate in research is about whether, non-audit services impact on something or other, or rotation of auditors impacts on something or other. Actually studying, and some of these comments, studying what auditors do and the way in which they do their work in more detail than standing off at a long distance away, is really an area that's massively underdeveloped. I think the other thing that we need to think about is the way in which we teach auditing and the way in which we communicate issues around audit research to our students. And if we drill audit students in just learning ISAs or learning IFRS, we're missing massive opportunities. And if you go into schools these days, the discipline of accounting is invisible. Schools recommend students go and study engineering, science, law. They don't talk about accounting and auditing. In some countries, high-ranking, high-rated students will never consider that as a career option. So what are we doing? Why are we killing the subject? So I think in many ways there's so much to do. I wouldn't personally be as sort of depressed as you. I'd liven it up a bit. I think audit is, I said before, you need to bring audit back to life. And in many respects, the way it's come to life is through this notion of things like an audit society, the spread of audit everywhere around various dimensions of society. We have audit in areas that we didn't have audit before. Why? Because we've lost trust in what people do, but we trust audit. But audit as a mechanism seems to be rooted also in failure. So you look at the development of standards. Look at what people, standards. People used to talk about being ahead of standards. Our practice is above the standard. Now the standards define the practice. The audit firms talk about being innovative, but they all comply with international standards. Those are contradictions. Where is the big firms nowadays in this whole debate that's going on? If you look in any major financial publication, the Financial Times, whatever, there's loads of comments about the role of auditing. The profession's saying relatively little. Why is that? Fascinating area to discuss. So I completely disagree with you. I think it's really alive, really exciting.
In terms of future research, new directions, if one would really want to have a better likelihood to be seen as innovative in doing auditing research, well, then this person should probably ignore what I presented and what you said, basically ignoring what people from what gatekeepers do, what gatekeepers say, because as editor, as associate editor, what I'm really looking for when I look at submissions is something which is going to surprise me. It happens from time to time, but not that often. So in order to surprise me, or in order to surprise people like me, I think researchers, younger researchers, should especially engage with other areas of research, reading in sociology, reading in anthropology, reading in economics, in order to be exposed to different ideas, and then perhaps find a way to incorporate a promising idea in the domain of auditing, which has not been explored until now.
Thank you. I'm sorry that Stephen wasn't inspired by what was said today, because for me, the speakers have inspired me so much in terms of what we have yet to do. And I know for Bertrand and I really feel that we have encouraged, and I hope we have encouraged people to look at the issues that we're facing right now within the audit profession. And we are at a serious crisis with it. And if nothing else, let us pause, like Chris has said, and think about things differently. Let us think, like Eve has said, not about maintaining the status quo, but doing something differently. Let us bring what Darren is talking about in relation to post-feminism into the audit arena and learn and help women to learn what is happening to them, help men learn in the environment in which we're working how we can perform better. So I'm inspired, and I hope Stephen will have some inspiration when he's leaving this room.
I don't want to add too much to what Mary just said. The only thing I'd like to add is that here we are both players and referees, because we decide what's going to be interesting, and then we're going to write about what we decide is interesting. And so this is some sort of a circular reasoning, and I agree that there is some sort of an issue here, and certainly one way to break it and go outside and go deep in the black box is to start from a practitioner's view. And I would encourage you and everybody here to, when we start to think about research questions, research problems, is to ask professional practitioners, auditors, and ask them, well, what's your problem? What's your problem? When you wake up every morning, what's your issue? And you talk to them, and usually they have a lot of problems. So that's also one way to bring new ideas, to be innovative, is not to start from our own conversation or own academic conversation, but to start from real, well, real is a very complicated word to use, but let's say real questions, real problems coming from the practice. Thank you again for participants. I think we had a great session, and I wish you all a great Congress. Thank you.